Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who have joined our call. And tonight, Professor Mike Green and I will discuss the subject matter at hand, and we hope that you'll participate with us and share your thoughts and ask questions as we go along. Please do not be afraid to use the raise hand function even while we're speaking. Okay. What I want to say with the future of Asia Pacific, one word, it looks great. The global trends favor nations with a strong emphasis on education and mathematics, even if it's too much at times. What is tech and what is the real economy are steadily fusing into one, where it's becoming blurred and indistinguishable. The work ethic in the region, combined with an incredible initiative and motivation to improve everyone's respective living conditions, augurs well for the region. However, the rising geopolitical tensions between China and the United States, and we will delve into this further with Mike very shortly, also represents the region with opportunities, but with the biggest risks. The biggest beneficiaries in the region already have world-class industries, such as Korea, Japan, Singapore, and India. However, that does not mean that Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Taiwan, and other nations do not stand to benefit. They will be benefiting, ironically, from the coming, what people have euphemistically called the splinternet, where the technology standards between China and the United States irreparably split in two, creating two supply chains, two technology platforms. Looking forward, the intra-Asia trade should grow much faster than the global trade overall. Intra-Asia business alliances will become more prevalent. Intra-Asia investments will rise substantially. We believe, looking forward, that commerce and the future in the Asia Pacific will be much more endogenous to Asia Pacific than through external nations, as it has been for most of the period since the end of World War II. Individuals need to be flexible and adaptable, and in their prime careers, they need to be able to relocate and go where the opportunities are, wherever that may be. But as I said at the beginning, the opportunities look great, but with two very serious risks on the horizon. And I think with that, let me turn it over to Professor Green. Mike, if you can just introduce yourself and start with the political risk, I would appreciate it.
Sure, thank you very much, Yunho. Thank you all of you for joining us from all over the Pacific Rim and beyond. I'm Director of Asian Studies and Professor at Georgetown, and I can tell you that when I look at the future of Asia, I see mostly optimism. And when I look at the future of US engagement with Asia, I'm also very optimistic. When I went to graduate school some decades ago, I spoke Japanese. I studied in Japan. It was considered pretty rare to speak one Asian language for an American in those days. Now we have students coming to Georgetown who speak two or sometimes three when they arrive, Japanese, Korean, and Thai, for example, and who are extremely comfortable, whether they're Americans operating in the Pacific or whether they're students from Korea or Japan or China operating in the US. So if you think about this as a long arc of history, what you see in the classrooms at Georgetown is a really dynamic, interactive set of young leaders who are going to keep the opportunities alive and hopefully manage the crises and black swans that we know are coming, even if we don't know exactly what they are. I also should quickly thank Yunho, who's been a personal friend and a real friend to Georgetown and to Asian Studies. His family's endowed Professor Cha's chair, helped with scholarships, given advice to students, and we're grateful. So we'll go back and forth, Yunho and I, and we'll give observations. I'll just say a couple quick grace notes to start on the security problems. For most of recorded history, Asia was at the center of civilization, or put a different way, Asian economic output was higher than Europe until the Industrial Revolution. And it rapidly reversed. And so for the past 200 years, we've essentially seen the most dynamic economic output from most of that period shift to Europe and then North America. Well, what we're going to see over the next few decades is the steady shift of production and economic dynamism to the Pacific. Europe will be important, the US will be important, Africa has demographic advantages. What that means is for most of American history, the West shaped Asia profoundly, not always for the best, so sometimes introducing important technologies. What we're going to see over the next few decades is how Asia shapes the West and the rest of the world. And the economic dynamism that Yunho describes is a good thing for growth globally. But Asia also has 5 of the world's nuclear weapon states. Asia has 2 unresolved Cold War conflicts on the Korean Peninsula and in the Taiwan Strait, 2 of the most, indeed, the 2 most heavily armed places in the world. And older rivalries between Japan and China in the East China Sea emerging. There is a thesis you may have heard of, the Thucydides trap by Professor Graham Allison at Harvard. He misreads Thucydides a little bit because he didn't go to Georgetown. But he misreads Thucydides and he says rising powers almost inevitably clash with status quo powers. Athens clashed with Sparta, Britain clashed with Germany, the US will clash with China. He misses 2 critical facts though. The first is that these clashes happen because of weakness of states on the periphery. The smaller city states, not Athens and Sparta, were the proximate causes of the war. It was Serbia, not Germany and France, that sparked World War I. The war between the US and Japan was sparked because of the collapse of European colonies and the vacuum that created that tempted Japan to expand into Southeast Asia. So the first point I'd say at security, is don't just focus on the US and China. Look at the Philippines, look at Mongolia, look at Vietnam. These are countries that will, when historians look back, determine whether or not Asia is peaceful or not. Their success is our success. And the second point I'd make is that Professor Allison misses is agency matters, leadership matters. And hopefully today we'll talk a little bit about the nature of Xi Jinping, of Suga, Yoshihide in Japan, of Moon Jae-in, of Joe Biden, because leaders matter a lot in whether or not we bend the arc of history in Asia towards the dynamism that Yunho describes, or some of the tragic paths we've seen in the 20th century. So, I wanted to throw something back at you, if that's okay. Intra-regional trade in Asia has been a feature since basically the appreciation of the yen in the mid-1980s, which created, for macroeconomic reasons in particular, production networks from Japan. And as those production networks have spread over the past decades, intra-regional trade in Asia has risen to over 50% of all trade. But one thing you said struck me, which is financial flows and foreign direct investment in Asia have been stubbornly global that entire time. Largest investors in China are not from Asia, they're Europe, for example. Largest investors in Southeast Asia are not China. Japan, Korea, Australia, and FDI is overwhelmingly more trans-Pacific than it is into China. So why would that change? Why would that change now? Why would the intra-regional trade now be, matched by intra-regional financial flows and FDI, which we haven't seen because financial markets haven't functioned as well in Asia because the capital's not been there. You're seeing something that the rest of us may not be seeing, and it's worth teasing out.
Mike, that's a great question. Great question. And what I see here is, I think the shift towards Asian countries doing business with each other in earnest and linking economies together have started. And I think the difference is this: the GDP, it's like after World War II, United States was what, 50% of the world's GDP? And the Asian GDP wasn't endogenously big enough, and people's development model was export to the United States, export to Europe, and that's how the external demand will help you develop. I think we've reached a very interesting inflection point, particularly with China now, but we definitely reached this with Japan and Korea, which is in order for the Asian countries to grow further, they have to create domestic demand and they have to trade with their neighbors, whom they actually have a lot in common with, and compared to, like, each nation brings something to the table, so you have a basis for trade and investment. So what I find really fascinating is I think that if the Asian nations trade grows with each other and investments grow with each other in a meaningful way, it will actually reduce the military tensions.
This is one of the oldest debates in international relations theory, and one of the first debates we introduce students at Georgetown to, especially in Asian studies. Theorists who say that economic interdependence then leads to institutions, then increases the cost of war because you lose economic growth, are often called liberal institutionalists. Curmudgeon realists say, no, the basic state of international affairs is anarchy. These patterns of economic interdependence, these international institutions can easily be broken by power rivalries. That's what happened in the 1930s. And one thing historians point to is at a time when Japan was undergoing profound political changes at home in the 1920s and 30s, the oligarchs, the Meiji oligarchs who had built modern Japan, who had sought to make Japan a responsible stakeholder, we might say, using today's jargon, had died off. The political institutions were weak. The military was growing stronger. Geopolitics were changing in Asia. Militarism was rising. But Japan was locked into the global and especially trans-Pacific economic architecture. And it was the global financial crisis in 29, and then Smoot-Hawley tariffs, US tariffs that cut trade in half to Japan and radicalized the army, turned them away from global capitalism towards conquest and autarky. Do you worry about that with decoupling today? The splinternet, you mentioned the splinternet earlier. There is going to be some decoupling of 5G, no doubt about it. Japan, the US, Canada, and others have blocked Huawei and Chinese firms from their domestic 5G markets. Do you worry about that, splinternet decoupling? Because that could kind of ruin the story you're telling.
Believe it or not, I'm not overly concerned about this. And in fact, I am in a minority on this, but I think the splinternet is actually a good thing. And I'll explain my position on this. I think the splinternet's a good thing because if they don't do it, I think this could be the flashpoint between China and the United States, actually more than the Taiwan Straits. If they split, you remove one of the two biggest stress points between China and the United States as a geopolitical rival. So you still got the Taiwan question, we still got the North Korea question, but you don't have then the question of you're trying to crush me technologically, which means, so this is the thing, right? Technology, economy, military is kind of blurred now, and I think it's going to be blurred even further. So I'm okay with this. And I think that the splinternet is actually going to help many of the peripheral Asian nations because they're going to get involved in two supply chains.
Like Vietnam, maybe, or well, that's tough though, because I mean, so for example, as you know, Samsung is, and Korean companies generally are shifting high-tech production to Vietnam. They're doing what Japan did over a decade ago, the so-called China Plus One. They're creating a separate supply chain in Southeast Asia where they have more, where labor's cheaper, but also they have more control of intellectual property rights and just friendlier relations, less political risk. I mean, the Vietnamese love Japan. Japan has a 95% favorability rating in Southeast Asia. It's a great place to invest if you're Japanese. And now Korea is doing that, partly because of high cost, partly because of intellectual property rights threat and competition from China, partly because China's embargo on Korean companies over security issues. You know, Lotte in particular took a pounding because they rented or leased land for an American military facility that the Chinese side didn't like. But also Korean movie companies and others have been hit with, you know, mercantilism. So So Vietnam's now, over 20% of Vietnam's output is from Samsung, one Korean company. So definitely the geopolitics is going to benefit countries that have friendly relations with Japan, Korea, Europe, and US, and good investment environment, high productivity. Vietnam, maybe Indonesia. They have a few more things to fix. So I can see what you're saying, but on the other hand, you have a country like Taiwan, where TSMC is actually stuck between these two production lines. I mean, for AI and advanced computing, which is necessary for AI, the semiconductor and fabrication strengths lie in the US, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. And TSMC has huge production in China, mainland China. They're under pressure from the US to pull that back, to build in the US, because of what you said, because the country that builds the fastest microprocessors will dominate AI and Internet of Things. It's not just about logarithms and data. It's about computation. So it actually puts a country an economy like Taiwan in a real pickle, right? They're trying to straddle this. So
I agree.
You say it's good, but it's good if you're Vietnam, but if you're Taiwan, that's kind of scary, isn't it?
I agree. Taiwan's in the most difficult position, but I think most of the nations are going to try to take the middle of the road approach, and they try to be kind of like Switzerland and turn to the United States and China says, we don't want to choose sides. We want to do business with both of you. We love both of you because it's in their interest. But going back to the military angle, what's kind of interesting, I think, is this. The difference between now and I see like in the past that led to some of the world conflicts is I don't really think you want to go and conquer another country anymore. I think what you want is you want to be able to leverage relationships to gain economic advantages. And as I said, economic, military, technology are getting blurred, right? Because the nation who has the best internet technology, who has the best e-platforms, also has the best cyber ability to protect themselves and to disrupt another nation.
Yeah, this is one of the arguments against war happening especially in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific, because when Japan invaded Manchuria, when the Mongols invaded China, when the French took Southeast Indochina and the British took Burma and Malaya, you could do something with that territory. You could extract rubber and oil and gas. You could build fortifications and railroads, and conquering territory doesn't mean as much. The commodities people care about are things like data and technology, right? Knowledge.
No, what you want is you don't want to conquer someone. You want customers.
You want customers, and that's because of technology, right?
Yes.
But technology also makes conflict more dangerous. So, for example, in a world of nuclear weapons, we thought that rightly that there wouldn't be war because the nuclear weapons deterred countries from attacking each other because the consequences were so huge. But you had a certain amount of transparency by the 1970s and 80s. The Soviets and the US knew each other's war plans. We knew each other's nuclear weapons strategies. We could read each other's intentions. The Cuban Missile Crisis was dangerous. But now you have cyber and space, so that countries, China, Russia, may be tempted to try to blind the US so it can't use weapons. How do you do that? Anti-satellite missiles. You shoot down US satellites. Well, China in 2007 tested that and it worked on their own satellite, and Russia's done it. You shoot down a satellite, the US is blinded. Or you use cyber to try to kill communications so that you can neutralize the US to deal with Taiwan. But if the US is blinded, it doesn't know whether or not nuclear weapons are being used. It makes escalation a lot more dangerous. That's just one example. So technology actually can make this even more dangerous. China's missiles can hit Japan, Taiwan, Guam. So it's much easier in a nanosecond without deploying ships or planes to fire. So the trigger is a lot, looser, a lot more triggery. It's a lot, there are fewer checks on the technology. We don't completely understand them. And then you add artificial intelligence, where there's a possibility to take the human element out and human judgment and human morality. So the technology actually makes the situation in some ways more dangerous. And
Mike,
yeah.
Mike, I agree, because what you're describing is Skynet.
Yeah, or Skynet, or that movie with Matthew Broderick in the 1980s where the computer starts a war game and starts the war. Yeah. Yeah, all those movies from the 80s that you and I grew up on are all becoming reality now, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
So, it is dangerous. So the question is, how do you stabilize the situation? How do you reduce the risk? I gave a talk a few years ago at a major investors conference in Hong Kong, and they were asking about the chance of war between Japan and China. This was when things were very hot. It was 2012. And I said the chances of war are double what they were a decade ago, but still less than 1%. Then they surveyed the audience, mostly investors and bankers and hedge funds. And they said, they asked the question, what do you think the chance of war is? And the average answer across an audience of 2,000 people was 30%, which is much higher than any of us would have said when I was in the Pentagon, really high. So then, after these conferences, you go out and you meet the investors if you're one of the speakers. So all the institutional investors asked us how they could, where they could invest safely. And then the hedge fund guys all came in to ask who to short, which was classic. But the question for governments and for scholars too is, how do you reduce the chance of war? And I think one way we tried to do that in Asia with limited success in the 90s and into the 2000s when I was in the Bush White House was institutions. East Asia Summit, APEC, TPP. Those aren't working so well now. The rivalries kind of overwhelm them a bit. There is CPTPP, so that the major economies are signing trade agreements. But the institutions that many of us thought 10, 20 years ago might stabilize the situation are broken. China's just not playing, and the Trump administration didn't want to play. The other way you do it is balance of power. And you said countries they don't love China. They love the US, but they want China's money, is how I would put it. And so Japan, Korea trade more with China than the US now. But their major security relationship is with the US. And what you're seeing is a balance of power strategy. The Quad with US, Japan, Australia, India. We could talk about it, but a significant strengthening of the US-Japan alliance and the US-Japan-Australia alliance. Countries, especially the larger countries, are shoring up the balance of power. They're strengthening their relations so that China can't bully them. And some people say that'll cause China to push back harder, but that's one play. A lot of us in the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations, to achieve that more stable balance, looked at India. And India's got good demographics, but half of Indians don't use flush toilets. So it's a big question mark. So, both in terms of the economy, but also a kind of stable Asia where there's a balance of power and the Chinese side isn't tempted to bully other countries. India is a really important player. And we're trying to do more in India at Georgetown, as you know. We have our India initiative. Do you look at India much where you are? Do you see an upside, glass half full, glass half empty?
Glass half full. And India really, for what I do, wasn't on the radar until the conflict over that region in the Himalayas kicked up. And one thing I will say is, and I'd like to get your opinion on this, I think one of the observations I've had living and working out here for 6.5 years now is, until I got out here, I had an underappreciation for the diversity that's inside of China. And so one of the reasons they're so paranoid about territorial integrity is they're afraid of giving an inch because they're afraid someone else could make a demand.
When I was in the White House, can I brag about Georgetown one more time?
Oh, please.
Right now, students who take Asian Studies at Georgetown take courses from myself, Evan Medeiros, and Victor Cha. And I was George W. Bush's senior Asia advisor on the National Security Council staff. Evan Medeiros was senior advisor for President Obama, same job. Victor Cha was the lead advisor on North Korea. And Dennis Wilder, who's one of our adjuncts, was my replacement. So we tell students, when we talk about these issues, China, Taiwan, India, Pakistan, one of your faculty was in the Situation Room with the president for 12 of the last 16 years. And then we tell them, you guys do about as well as the US National Security Council does figuring out how to solve these problems. One more thing that gives us hope. Yeah, the India equation is really, really important. You know, demographics very strong, young, high literacy, infrastructure really bad. As I said, this may not be true anymore, but a few years ago, there was a New York Times story that said half of Indians still don't use flush toilets. So basic sanitation is a huge drag on productivity, obviously, but also on things like women's empowerment. You know, gender-based violence in India is a problem because of this. Toilets are not inside the house and basic things like that. Then you have countries like Japan, Korea, the EU, that want to invest in that infrastructure and have an economic and political stake in bringing India up. The complicated one is India and China. And you're right, China is incredibly insecure about its ethnic minorities. And Tibet in particular is a real source of sensitivity. Greater Tibet, the Tibetan Empire from 1,000, 1,100 years ago, was not just in what we think of as the Tibet Autonomous Region. It spanned Guizhou, Sichuan, Inner Mongolia. 80 to 90% of Mongolians are Tibetan Buddhists. So if you're China, and you also remember that in the 19th century, the Japanese sent spies to Tibet to foment anti-Han or anti-Qing splitism. And in the 40s, the CIA in the late 40s sent agents to Tibet to foment anti-Chinese splitism. I don't think there are Japanese and CIA spies there now. But if you're an insecure party like the Chinese Communist Party, and you know that history, and you realize that if you split China up based on ethnic minorities, half of the landmass of China would be gone between Mongolians and Tibetans and Uyghurs. So I think the insecurity of China internally is often underestimated as a driver for why China takes risks. You know, why is China boycotting Australia? You know, a proud country that's not going to give in. Why did it do it to Korea? You know, why announce an air defense identification zone over Japan and Korea's airspace? Why take away Hong Kong's autonomy? You know, why piss off other major countries? You know, Deng Xiaoping had a good thing going. Get rich, bide your time. And I think part of the answer has to be because of insecurity about all these things at home. Which, you know, when we talk about the glass half full, glass half empty, that's kind of glass half empty, because if there is a crisis in the Taiwan Strait, will the Central Military Commission and Xi Jinping be thinking about economic growth or the splitting up of China if they don't act forcefully to defend their autonomy?
Latter.
Right?
What you just said.
Right. That's a little worrisome. What do we do? Train
No,
Georgetown
so
students.
but this is the risk, because you see, if this risk could be contained or reduced, the amount of, I think you would have an investment boom in Asia. I mean, this is the thing that's holding back a tidal wave of capital actually coming into the Chinese capital markets right now. It's the risk that makes the Asians kind of want to squirrel some money away and invest anywhere but the region. It's this tail risk. Now, I think that if there is greater economic prosperity and a further continuous rise in the standard of living, it works to reduce this risk, because I firmly believe when people have more to lose, they will weigh that a little bit more than if they have little to lose.
Yeah, that's for sure. And if they know people,
I mean, how many US Soviet
right.
potential crisis was diffused because the generals and the admirals knew somebody on the other side?
I mentioned earlier agency and leadership. I teach a course at Georgetown on Asian leaders throughout modern history, starting with Yoshida Shigeru in Japan, Deng Xiaoping, Lee Kuan Yew, Ho Chi Minh. So students can understand how much leaders matter in these issues, and leaders' experiences and background and choices and prejudices. And also they get a sense, because I do leaders in the 40s and 50s, then I do leaders today, which of course in many cases are their grandsons, Abe, Xi Jinping.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Shinzo,
Because
Park
they're
Geun-hye.
hereditary political
Yeah.
family.
And so it tells you a lot about the importance of leaders, but also the arc of Asian history, political culture. And one of the things that worries me the most actually about US-China relations right now, and I think Biden's going to be inclined to fix this, is if you had a crisis right now in the Taiwan Strait and the White House met, the Situation Room, the National Security Council met, I don't think they'd be able to tell the president who to call. I know what they'd say. They'd say what we said to President Bush in April 2001 when a Chinese jet crashed into a US surveillance plane and we had a crisis. Call Jiang Zemin. And you know what? President Bush called Jiang Zemin 12 times. 12 times. Jiang wouldn't pick up because the Chinese system didn't want their leader on the phone unprepared. And the PLA had told him, no, the American plane crashed into our plane. It's their fault. And they didn't want to be embarrassed by having Bush. So eventually President Bush had to call the leader of Brazil, who called, it was like junior high school, who called Jiang Zemin and said, dude, George is trying to reach you. And President Bush came away from that realizing that the structure of US-China relations, despite huge economic interdependence, when there's a crisis, there's not the trusting, you don't have to like each other or agree with each other, but there's not that level of trust you have at high levels for dialogue. And, you know, Bush had it with Jiang and Hu. Xi is a tougher customer. Xi Jinping was a tougher customer. Obama had a harder time with Xi Jinping. I don't think the Trump administration has it. I don't think the Chinese like or trust him anymore. They had some hope at the beginning. Biden will have to establish that. But it's tricky because in Zhongnanhai in China, scholars will tell you nobody knows who speaks for Xi Jinping either. Who would he delegate as his person for this trusted dialogue? You know, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Bobby Kennedy and Ambassador Dobrynin would meet in Georgetown for breakfast. And that was the dialogue. That was the channel that kind of saved us from the Cuban Missile Crisis. We don't have that with China right now, which is amazing when you think about how intertwined we are economically and how consequential a conflict would be. It's government is not like business. Like you would never do that in business.
No, and so I think, it's interesting. We started with, when I give my introduction, and I think this might be a good time to invite people to ask us any questions or share thoughts. But we've come back to a great future with this tail risk. And it's a very difficult tail risk because it's very difficult to model or to come up with a solution that looks workable. So, I just realized this. Before we turn over, I should do a quick introduction of myself. I hadn't actually done that.
I should have done that. My bad. Yeah.
No, all right. So my name is Yoon Ho Song. I'm a graduate of the School of Foreign Service in 1986. My family immigrated to the United States from South Korea in 1970. And by sheer accident, the 35 years I've been working, I have spent approximately 27 out of 38 years outside of the United States. And the last 6.5 years, I've been working here in Hong Kong and in China. My employer is the Ping An Insurance Group.
And a very, very strong and loyal friend of Georgetown. Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, we should bring people in.
So please, any thoughts or questions you may have? You guys can chat to us or raise your hands. It's up to you. Okay, go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Yoon. I went to Georgetown for MBA in 2004. I'm Korean, but I actually live in the Philippines. And last couple of years, it's been very interesting with, with especially the Chinese flowing in, in business infrastructure with the One Belt, and also capital flowing in from through for casino business, which is driving up the real estate. Actually, so I think it's actually holding up the whole property market and real estate market. And on the other side, there's the the military base issue in the south. They're expanding And I think, you mentioned that territorial issues are becoming less important, but on the other hand, I think they are actually becoming more aggressive in terms of securing resources like natural gas and trade routes in the Pacific. So I want to take your, and all of course, and the leadership had been very interesting in the Philippines as well with the President Duterte and all the strongmen, presence in Asia. So I want to see how you would see the military issues, especially in the Pacific, resolving, and if how American and Chinese relationship would, how would it play out going forward? Thank you.
You want to do them one at a time, Yunho?
Yeah, Mike, you go first.
So yeah, it's a great question, and the Philippines is a fascinating place to be right now. It's on the front lines of everything we're talking about. I think what Yunho and I was saying was that owning territory doesn't matter the way it did in the 18th and 19th centuries. So conquering large swaths of land, the Germans taking the Ruhr Valley back from the French so they can have coal and steel, or Japan taking Manchuria so they can have, in the 1930s, so they can have a breadbasket. That kind of military seizing of natural resources it's not gone, it's much less important. But then you raise the one important exception. What about these acute territorial disputes in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and in the Himalayas? But your question was about the maritime disputes. And they are much more intense now, actually, which is the exception to what we were saying. And initially, a lot of analysts and scholars thought it was because of energy. But I'd say the preponderance of views now is that energy is not the major factor. Yes, China intimidates Vietnam when an Indian firm builds an oil rig near Vietnam, or Japan and China, the problem intensifies when China builds an oil rig and violates the agreement that Japan thought they had, that there wouldn't be unilateral drilling in the East China Sea. So the proximate cause sometimes is the presence of an oil rig, but a rational approach to extracting resources would be a multinational investment, not sending ships and making it impossible to invest. And in general, the resources are harder to extract than people thought. There's probably less than they thought. Fish is sometimes a factor, frankly, fishing fleets, especially in the East China Sea with Japan, in that confrontation. But the main driver, the main reason that this is becoming more acute is geopolitical. And if you think about Chinese history, China's 100 years of shame began with the Opium Wars. And the Opium Wars were the British and French fleets coming from the sea. Then China was shamed by the Japanese invasion from the sea. And then it was contained by the US in the Cold War from the sea. So as a kind of natural geopolitical buffer, China, as its power returns, is trying to control the littoral areas, the maritime areas on its flank. That's what the US did with the Monroe Doctrine. It's what rising powers do. The problem is that means China is trying to assert control over waters that through which 50% of container traffic flows, 80% of Japan and Korea's energy imports, and which extend to the first island chain. The first island chain has been under American control, or American-Japanese allied control, since 1945. And so it's you can't just control, if you're China, you can't just control your maritime buffer without taking away security from Japan, the US, Korea, the Philippines. And that's why it's so intense. That's the main reason. It's geopolitical. And then nationalism, which we talked about it before. Countries, populations, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Philippines, their populations are giving governments very little leeway to compromise on these things.
And Mike, you hit a great point right there, and I just want to add this. You guys, this is where technology is a problem. And I'll give you guys an example of this. It's the iPhone, it's the social media, it's boxing political leaders in. I mean, I have got to tell you, if there was iPhone, social media, and the internet in the 1960s, I think we could have had a few much harsher outcomes with the USSR because we kept it quiet. I mean, you guys know this. I mean, because the information's come out now, but during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a rogue Soviet commander on the ground who just said, hell with the Americans, and he hit the button, fired an anti-aircraft missile, and killed a U-2 plane. That was not what he was supposed to do. He just snapped and says, that's it. But the Russians called the Americans and they were able to defuse it because the Americans believed that this was true when the Russians said that was a rogue. We never told him to do that. We told him actually not to do that. But can you imagine now? This could be, going viral, the plane being downed. I mean, so you'd have a real problem as a political leader. What do you do?
For our first year master's students in Asian studies, we do a crisis scenario every year. And the students, of course, are from the US and Japan, Australia, and Korea, and China, and Vietnam, and they're internationalists and the Georgetown students. So they're usually, when the crisis happens, and this year the crisis was over territorial issues, they're usually very rational, very diplomatic. And then the control team, which is the faculty, starts shooting social media at them and putting domestic pressure on them. And they all buckle. They all find it really hard to manage that as they're trying to deal with a crisis. So we humble them a little bit. It's not like a game of Risk. These pressures are huge. You see the question in the chat from Ian Borchardt?
Yeah, there's one from Ian and also from Chi Shu. So
Yeah.
the one on India is a really interesting question, which is what does a stagnated economy mean for Indian political power? My view, not good. India needs to go, the level of economic development India needs to have in front of it is really, really large because they've come a long way, but we're talking about a country with the income per capita of what, $2,200? So to me, with India, and Mike, you've hit the nail on the head with the problem with the sanitation system. Whether India could make the next move up or not, to me, comes down to whether they could build infrastructure.
Yeah.
This is the thing that China did par excellence, was just to build a world-class infrastructure. Because if you don't have the infrastructure, you can't arbitrage your labor advantage.
And countries like Japan especially, but also Korea are helping. I mean, there's the Delhi-Mumbai corridor, which is an infrastructure corridor, everything from roads to high-speed rail to refrigeration units, is being funded by Japan. And now there's a corridor to Chennai on the East Coast. And connecting India's infrastructure to Southeast Asia and to Japan and Korea, this sort of southern maritime route, is geopolitically really important for Japan, for India, for the US. And so there are geopolitical and economic reasons why India will get help. But India's got, if you've ever dealt with India, major economic decisions are made at the state level, not the central level, not in Delhi. And you have this weird situation where some states that are run by communists are economically the most efficient and free market. And others run by local parties or the Congress Party are not. And so it's a patchwork. And so I suspect India will have uneven growth. It'll depend on the state. The other thing India can do is empower women. If India can make it safe for women to work and bring women into the workforce, the productivity gains will be huge. This is what Abe discovered. Why he.
No, but Mike, this is what I'm saying about infrastructure. You need to have better roads, trains, and subways, so women could get to work and home safer.
That's a really good point. This is my wife's area of expertise, but women's empowerment is about changing norms, but it's also about infrastructure. So Abe, for example, in Japan made huge gains changing the discussion about women. Over half of the Japanese foreign ministry, trade ministry, entering classes now are women. And women are on boards for the first time in Japan. Over 2 million women join the workforce, which is I think the fastest and highest growth in women's economic participation in the OECD in its history. But then boom, infrastructure, daycare, long commutes, all the challenges that come with that. So they're two sides of the coin. But I'm generally bullish on India, but it's going to be slow and incremental. India is not going to change quickly. There's a great question on Cambodia and Myanmar.
Yes, for me,
I spent
in both parts.
I've spent time in both countries. It's interesting. Talk about a young country. Cambodia is a very young country, and youth aged 18 to 30 in surveys are very pro-US, very pro-Japan, and want democracy. But the country is run by Hun Sen, an old school Soviet trained, Cold War authoritarian leader who if he didn't do it himself, his cronies assassinated political opponents, and it's a real challenge. And China has huge economic influence in Cambodia through infrastructure investment and through large amounts of cash passed to the Hun Sen regime. So I think in the near term, Cambodia, you look at the 10 ASEAN countries, Cambodia is probably the most under China's sway. But this is the thing we haven't talked about. In surveys I've done of elites and publics in Asia, overwhelmingly when asked, they want democracy. They want accountability. And so, the Chinese are offering economic investment with very few conditions, and they're offering to some authoritarian leaders a lot of cash. And that's what a lot of the people in these countries want. But this generation that's now in their 20s in Cambodia, in Myanmar, all indications are they're going to want more accountability from their governments. So over time, I think none of these countries will be owned by anybody. And if they have improved governance and more accountability, they're gonna push for their sovereign choices. But right now in Southeast Asia, I'd say over the last few years, the US has lost ground and China has gained ground. But you know who's gained more ground than China? Japan and Korea.
I agree. All right, let's go to Mohammed's question. Mohammed, Mike, can you see his question? I'll just read it. His question is, will Japan over the coming years have to decide between accepting to live with, oh shoot, I just lost it.
I think, yeah.
With the sphere of influence rising, or Chinese sphere of influence rising, or align itself with the US to counter the Chinese influence? Or does Japan have a third option?
So I tell my students that when the sun goddess Amaterasu dipped her spear in the Pacific Ocean and created the archipelago that became Japan and created the imperial line sometime around the 7th century, that imperial line to this day was led by an emperor. It's the only other place in Asia other than China that insists it has an emperor. The Shilla people, the Burmese, the others, they all had kings or princes or shahs. Japan's the only one that consistently throughout history has insisted we too have an emperor. And it was done from the beginning to indicate that the land of the right, as Prince Shotoku wrote to the Sun Emperor, Japan is the land of the rising sun. China is the land of the setting sun. There are brief periods in Japanese history where Chinese hegemony was somewhat accepted, but most of Japanese history is about defying Chinese hegemony. And Abe gave a speech in Washington in 2013, and he was asked this question, and he said, Japan is not now and will never be a tier 2 country. So I think the answer to the question is unambiguously aligned with the US, but Japan's worried about the US, as are many countries, particularly after the Trump years, but it began before the Trump presidency. And so Japan's reaching out to India, especially to Australia, and more and more to the EU, to Southeast Asia, to prevent Chinese hegemony in Asia. And that's the one country where Japan's not reaching out enough is Korea, unfortunately, because that's the most important neighbor they have if they're worried about China. So I think that's the answer to the question. Japan is, real quickly, Japan is navigating this very well, though. Under Abe, Japan has strengthened the alliance with the US, strengthened the Quad, which was a Japanese idea with India, Australia, all these counterbalancing strategies to stop China's hegemony, and is making a ton of money in China. Japan pushed the US to block 5G in our market, so Japan had cover to do it in their market. But the Japanese government is not supportive, in my view, is not supportive of US efforts to completely cut off semiconductor exports to China. So that's Japan is finding the sweet spot. between protecting home markets and technology, but still getting rich off of China. And that's kind of where I think they come down.
Mike, the only thing I was going to add is
Mm-hmm.
what this also does is we don't call it an arms race, but every nation will strengthen and spend more money. Now, this might have been kind of an accidental byproduct of Trump's plan, however haphazard it was. But everyone's going to want to have a much stronger, what I call, what's the right word I'm looking for? Defense, or how about retaliation capability?
Yeah.
So they're not going to start it, but they want their neighbors or their rivals to know, I can punch back pretty hard.
This is true on the military side, and it's why Australia, Japan, Korea are all developing strike missiles. All of them, all of our allies. It's not that they're doing it because they don't trust us completely. They just want more options. And they're all debating or developing air-to-surface or surface-to-surface missiles to hit back if they have to. The question now being debated a lot, you've probably seen it in the press a bit, is can we do that economically? So Beijing organized a boycott against Lotte, cost Korea, I don't know what, probably $2 billion. Boycotted Philippine banana exports to punish the Philippines over territorial issues. Now it's Australia that's getting clobbered. And Beijing has demands that range from don't call for an investigation of coronavirus in the World Health Organization to don't let your academics criticize China over human rights. A democratic country like Australia can never say yes. And so there's a huge boycott of Australian wine, of Australian coal, of Australian LNG. And now the debate is, what can we do? Should we set up a fund, like an emergency reserve fund among democracies, so that we help Australia? Do we all start buying more Australian wine? I'm all for that. But I personally don't need a lot of Australian coal, although my wife tells me Santa Claus may have other ideas about that this year. So, what do we do? I mean, missiles, yeah, that's fairly obvious. But if there's economic punishment like this, what do the rest of us do? We don't want to cut off China because we need the economic growth, and that's dangerous in security terms. That's a really tough one. I mean, I hope the Biden administration thinks of ways to create an emergency fund or some kind of maybe WTO case. But it's what's going on in Australia, if you're following it, is not good if you're another middle power in Asia that is a little defiant of China's demands.
Oh, no, it's not good for anybody. And I think what this should incentivize people to do is, as I said, on the military front, people are developing what I call the retaliation capability. And on the economic front, what they need to do. So I got to be careful saying this, but here's one of what I see as a weakness in China, which is this. We're taught this organizationally in business, which is never make an issue unless you're prepared to make it an issue. In other words, don't elevate something unless you're prepared to fight over it. Unfortunately, in China, there's just too many things becoming a fight when it's not worth the fight.
Yeah.
So what this shows me with what's going on with Australia is that every nation has to recognize that they cannot live with economic dependence on China unless they're ready to become a tributary state.
But even the countries that look like they're tributary states, people point to Cambodia or Laos or Pakistan. You go to those countries, you spend time there as I have, they're still very nationalistic themselves. Their governments are going to be held accountable at some point for how they handle this China pressure. So the game isn't over anywhere. And there's a question about Belt and Road, which you should answer, but if it's from Jeff Zorner. But if I could just segue to that and then turn over to you, Yunho. The interesting thing to me about Belt and Road is there are some military dimensions. China is building dual-use ports the PLA could use in Gwadar, Pakistan, in Chakpao in Myanmar, and so forth. But for the most part, China's exporting excess capacity and trying to build influence. And some would say, hegemony. But this is where competition can be virtuous. I tell my students, if we say to countries like Cambodia, don't do Belt and Road, a lot of them will say, no, we need the infrastructure. There's more infrastructure demand than the US, China, Japan, World Bank, Asia Development Bank combined can cover. But if the US, as the Trump administration has to some extent, steps up in this game, and Japan's really stepped up, and Korea's stepping up, and if OECD countries with transparent governance are offering loans as an alternative, that's going to put pressure back on China to be more accountable in its lending. And so, in trade theory, there's something called competitive trade liberalization, where when countries negotiate trade agreements, it puts pressure on each other to lower barriers to trade. It increases growth and interdependence. And I could see that possibly happening with Belt and Road, where if the US and Japan, Korea, and other countries are offering alternatives, that's going to put pressure on the China Development Bank to be more transparent, more accountable. And I can tell you, I know some of the people in the China Development Bank, they welcome that competition. They like that pressure to go back to Xi Jinping and say, hey, we got to do more. We can't do debt traps. We got to be more accountable. So I'm not totally pessimistic about Belt and Road. There is a military dimension that is worrisome, but with JBIC and the U.S. Development Finance Corporation and others, if we get in the game, I think it could be a virtuous competition. But that's theoretical. I don't know if that
Well,
is what you're thinking.
there is a chance for us to get in the game, and this is going to be a one for the Biden administration to answer. I mean, if they do a Trump administration too, then we're going to throw the white towel in, because each nation, this is to answer Ian's question as well. I think each nation is going to chart their own path. These relationships are too complicated to create a consortium of centrist countries. Each country is going to try to walk what I call the middle or the optimal line for themselves. But as a result, we have a chance, Mike, because all these nations want American participation. And let me be honest, not because they necessarily love America, but because they also understand that they get a better deal from the Chinese if you have the Americans around.
Yep, that's what Mahathir did in Malaysia.
Yeah,
He basically, won surprisingly won an election, told the Chinese, we don't want your Belt and Road deal, started talking to the Americans and the Japanese, and Chinese lowered the price.
yeah, yes, that's
some
the
people in the White
virtuous side.
House. Some people in the White House thought, good, Mahathir's on our side now, and they were disappointed when he went back. But no, that's the game we probably want to see.
Yes.
Use us to get a better deal.
Mike, another question we have is, what's your thoughts on the old one, the Korea-China rivalry, and the influence or the impact that China can have on the rivalry?
You mean Japan-Korea rivalry?
Yeah.
And the China police? At one level, I'm very optimistic about Japan-Korea relations and the US-Korea alliance. When you look at public opinion polls in Japan and Korea, when people are asked, is China a threat? It's not that different. Koreans are worried about China too, just like Japanese. When you ask, as I have in survey research, Korean and Japanese thought leaders, what should the future order in Asia be? They all say open, rules-based, strong US alliances, no coercion, liberal, neoliberal order. The Asia that Koreans and Japanese want is identical. And so over the longer term, and they want strong alliances with the US. And they also want a productive economic relationship with China. It's very little variation in how the Japanese and Koreans see the US or Asia. But how they see each other, man, is that bad. And it's so bizarre. It's one of these anomalies in international relations. How can two people with, democracies, allies of the US, with the almost identical vision of the future of Asia, have such mistrust between each other? And it's a long story we won't get into. It's politics, it's a lot of things. And it's not going to get fixed easily, by the way, because Prime Minister Suga is under almost zero pressure domestically to compromise with Korea on these issues. He faces no political backlash at home, and relatively little pressure from the outside world. I think that the US, Europe, others feel empathy for Korea as a victim of Japan's colonialism, but as a matter of international law, they're sympathetic to Japan's position that the Blue House can't just overturn treaties like the 1965 treaty. Moon Jae-in, on the other hand, is totally stuck because he would face an enormous backlash if he compromised at home. And so they're really stuck. And it's really one of those things where, so this is another one, by the way. I have a class where I have students negotiate the Japan-Korea impasse. And Japanese and Korean students at Georgetown can do it in about 3 minutes. Easy. And then I say, okay, now I want some of you to pretend you're Sankei Shimbun and some of you to pretend you're Omae News. And then they can't do it. They spend 2 hours, they can't do it. What's worrisome to me about it is one thing really, and that is as long as Japan and Korea are at odds, I think it fuels conceit in Beijing that the future of Asia is not about democracy. The future of Asia is about old rivalries. And if the future of Asia is about old rivalries, China is going to be tempted to split Japan and Korea, to criticize Western imperialism, to ignore the democratic norms that unify Japan and Korea. That's a huge, huge, for Japan and Korea and their diplomacy, for both countries, that's like playing soccer with your legs tied together. I mean, it's a huge mistake. But the domestic politics just make this one very, very tough.
But the only thing I would add with that is the domestic politics, both nations makes this very, very difficult. But this is the competition. They also understand that they're much more aligned with each other and that the risk is China.
Yeah. Well, there is a theory that because Japanese and Koreans know they'll never fight a war with each other, they can criticize each other, whereas they're both afraid China might shoot at them. So in a way, there is this hypothesis that it's easy for Japanese and Koreans and social media to attack each other because the consequences are low.
Yes, whereas with the other one, it's really serious.
Now, you go too far with China, God knows what will happen, or Russia.
Yeah, and we got only one too many examples of this, some of it real time now, right?
It is such an amazing thing. I have conservative Korean friends, Hanaradang, Korean Military Academy, conservative Korean friends, whose mothers got married when they were 14 or 15 so that they wouldn't be recruited as comfort women. And they have Japanese friends who have no idea. And I have liberal Japanese friends, very liberal Japanese friends, Asahi Shimbun, who go to Yasukuni Shrine to worship every year because their grandfather died in the Pacific Islands during the war. And their Korean friends have no idea. And I sometimes feel like just an honest, open dialogue would make such a difference. And that's not something the US can broker. I mean, what will happen if the US brokers is both sides will be mad at the US. But it won't be a war. It's not like Japan and Korea are going to fight a war. There's an interesting question I saw, we should address, which is, I don't see who asked it anymore, but someone named Bruce about mistrust or anxiety about the US. I have to say, I've been a little deflated that since our election, friends in the Japanese political world, in Singapore and Australia, they're not jumping up and saying, oh, hooray, the US is back. There's something about the Trump years and maybe some memories about the Obama years, because there's a bit of anxiety in Japan about Biden, a bit, that makes me think that some of our best friends in Asia think the US didn't just catch a cold, we have like a genetic disorder. I wrote, my last book was a history of US strategy in Asia since 1783. And the bottom line is that the US, when countries try to push the US out of Asia, we push back very hard. Doesn't matter whether it's Britain in the 19th century or Japan or the Soviet Union in the 20th century or China now. And public opinion polls in the US show stronger support for allies than ever. And so I think the US is going to be very heavily engaged, but there is definitely anxiety in Asia because of our sort of drunken, revelry, or whatever it was over the past few years. And
Mike, it's beyond that, because look, when President Obama drew those red lines in Syria and didn't do anything.
That's right.
If I was a military ally of the United States, I'd be really worried about any treaty I signed.
Obama administration officials like Dennis McDonough who is a Georgetown grad, were stunned at how Japan and Korea were shocked at the Syria red line. And I had a chance to talk to them. I said, it's not like one part of the world doesn't watch what the US does in the other part of the world. So this is the point. I think people like Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan in the next administration will understand. We have to earn back the trust. The good news is that overwhelmingly, look, in Japan, in Korea, in Australia, in Singapore, and India, it's not like there's a plan B. There's not, when I ask Japanese friends or Australian friends, what are you going to do now that you're a little worried about the US? And they say, we're going to do more with Europe. And that's great. How many battalions is Belgium going to send to defend you when China invades the Senkakus? I mean, yes, the Europe-Asia connection is really important and on political issues has been under leveraged by both Europe and countries like Japan. But at the end of the day, it's the US that's going to have to be the security guarantor. And I'm personally very confident the American public, the American Congress on a bipartisan basis is strongly behind that. But the Biden administration is not just going to get a free pass because it's not the Trump administration. They're going to have to earn this back.
Yeah,
That's
totally
really
agree.
clear. I think a lot of them know it, a lot don't.
Yeah, we got an interesting question we hadn't spoken or touched yet, which is, what do you think Russia's role is here in the Asia Pacific? Or their interest?
I was about to say they just want to be liked, but that's not right. They just want to be feared. Russia wants to be respected. And they try to earn that respect occasionally by a diplomatic initiative that doesn't get a lot of attention, to be honest. For example, Putin proposed solving the North Korean nuclear problem by having Japan and Korea pay for a pipeline that would go through North Korea and then send Russian oil to Japan and Korea. So the Russian diplomatic initiatives are always self-serving and usually not very influential. The other way they get attention is by doing things like they just did, putting new weapons, surface-to-air missiles on the occupied northern territories off of Japan, or doing bomber exercises with the Chinese near Japan and Korea. They flex their muscle. And the Russian Far East Air Force is at an operational tempo, is flying around Japan and Korea and prompting the US Air Force, the Korean and Japanese Air Forces to scramble at the same rate as the 1980s. So Russia's a spoiler. On the other hand, the US and Russia, Japan and Russia, Korea and Russia, we have things we can work on. The North Korean nuclear problem, energy, and it's in our interest to try, but I think it'll be frustrating. And at the end of the day, I think Russia's interests really lie with much closer ties to Korea and Japan. But Putin's interests lie in closer ties to Xi Jinping politically, and that's going to be an obstacle, but we should play the long game with Russia, in my view.
All right, fine. Here's another question. We got a few more questions before we end the session, but we're going to try to address these questions, which are really, really good questions. Which is, what's an interesting question is, what do you think the approach we should take with the North Korea or for advising the Biden administration? Because the dialogue, and this is the question that David Satterwhite wrote, which is, it's always focused on the North Korean threat to everybody else. But if you look at it from their point of view, we're quite a big threat to them.
Sure. So Victor Cha and I, when we were in government, were very involved in negotiations with North Korea. We both made trips to Pyongyang, Beijing, Berlin to negotiate with the North Koreans, New York. I've been in multiple negotiations with the North Koreans. I bragged earlier that, no major discussion on Asia in the White House over the last few decades happened without a Georgetown professor there. We also have a bipartisan record of completely failing over the same period to denuclearize North Korea. We've tried sanctions, we've tried negotiations, Trump tried a summit. Bottom line is, this is one of the hardest problems in US foreign policy because nuclear weapons are critical to the survival of the Kim family regime. And So, you know, they're threatened, absolutely. So if we gave them a security guarantee and said, we won't use nuclear weapons against you, we'll pull back troops and so forth, would North Korea give up nuclear weapons? I believe the answer is absolutely not. Because even if the US pulled, let's say the US said, you know, some people think Donald Trump wanted to pull troops off the Korean Peninsula, declare a peace treaty and get out. Let's say we did that. Is North Korea going to think it doesn't need nuclear weapons? Of course not, because they're still worried about China. And they'll be worried about Japan. And if the US really, really does pull out, then they're going to be worried about a Japan or Korea with nuclear weapons. So there is no safety for a North Korean regime that is this determined to defy international relations. And
Mike, I
ultimately,
think you hit the nail right on the head.
Yeah.
America is currently the biggest threat to them, but it's not the only threat.
and you know what the biggest threat to them actually is? It's not the US, it's the North Korean people.
Yes.
Nuclear weapons allow them to say, we're fighting the world, we're defying the world. If they actually had to address the needs of the North Korean people, they'd be done. That regime would be done. I think we should try negotiating with North Koreans, but it's going to be incremental. It's going to be hard. There's no silver bullet. There's no, the North Koreans, when I was in the negotiations, had not even thought about a negative security assurance, a promise not to attack each other. So they studied it and they told us, we studied these and we decided they don't work. The Soviets and the Nazis had them, they attacked each other. The Japanese and the Soviets had them, they attacked each other. These never work in history. So the North Koreans don't even believe in them, in these kind of non-aggression pacts. So I think it's, unfortunately, it's just a messy, hard problem.
Yeah, I've spoken to Victor about this. This is like the problem without an answer.
What you do is you deter the North Koreans with strong alliances. You have to slow down their proliferation with sanctions and inspections. You do what you can to help the North Korean people through humanitarian aid. You try diplomacy, you try opening them up, and this is another one, you play for the long haul. And eventually there may be a change in regime, there may be a change in circumstances, and at least if you're working with Japan and Korea and hopefully China and Russia, you're ready. Because that's one of those situations where change will come, but it's not going to be because of our diplomatic negotiations. It's going to be something else. A natural disaster, death of Kim Jong-un, but you got to do the diplomacy now so that you're ready to take advantage of or deal with whatever that is.
All right, Mike, I think this is going to be our last question. And I want to thank everyone for great questions. And if we didn't get a chance to answer them, I apologize. If you send us the questions, we will try to answer them all. So this one's from Yoshiki Uchida. And this is a really interesting question. If you can read I'll just read it for everybody very quickly, which is, if you look at the background of the Chinese political leadership, it's very domestic centric. No one studied or has international experience. And forgive me if I'm summarizing this too quickly, but they have a lot in common with the early 1930s Japanese militaries who rose to power. So what's the best way to speak to them?
May I have some more comments about that? You see that you are talking mainly about economics and infrastructure, etc., which is really understandable. But at the same time, that whether it is, I think it might be necessary for us to see the ideology side of the Chinese Communist Party. And what I see as a Japanese is that what the Chinese Communist Party is insisting is quite resembling to that of the Japanese militaries before the Second World War, which caused that sort of a bad war. They originally said that they needed to stop Russia to occupy China and also take Siberia. And but as a Chinese so weak, that's why that the Japanese need to get into that area. And eventually that they fought with all the world and lost miserably. And but what the Chinese militaries, or sorry, that the Chinese Communist Party is now saying is quite resembling that they want to recover Chinese pride before the war with Western countries, and taken their Hong Kong was taken by the UK or other countries. So that that sort of ideology may be one of the background that the Chinese Communist Party is expanding so many different areas, including India or other areas. They want to expand to the maximum land that they have occupied, and also the sea area that they want to have. So then they say that they want to recover the pride of the Chinese people in a glorious time. And actually, that there's a lot of misunderstanding and exaggeration. But still, that it seems to me that the Chinese Communist Party is sticking that sort of idea that led Japan to the World War in the past. So that you see, democracy is one of the problem for them, because that most of those Chinese leaders just heritage their ancestor or their grandparents' success after the Second World War. And therefore, that if there's a fair competition, etc., that's a problem for them, because that they know that they cannot keep their position. And the weakest point of the Chinese expansion theory is that point.
Yeah.
Why people don't criticize that portion, and also tell the Chinese people, common people, that your leader is completely wrong and may disrupt the whole country eventually, and also disrupt their life.
There are some, oh, sorry.
Yeah, and you see that the economy and the infrastructure arguments may not solve the issue, because the China itself now has certain economic power, and they have certain know-how about establishing the infrastructure. And the Chinese Communist Party believes that the reason that Japan lost the war is that because of the technology and also weak economy. And therefore, that what they have right now is that they have taken the technology, even if it is a stolen one, and also that they have a strong economy right now, and especially when that other Western world is as a mess because of the COVID-19 issue. That this is a good chance for them to recover all the past history.
So Uchida-san, I have, so historians will warn us all, don't do direct parallels between 2 points of history, because you can come to the wrong conclusion.
Yeah.
History rhymes, it doesn't repeat. But I've had the same thought myself for some time now, that the parallels between China today and Japan in the late 20s, early 30s are really striking. The decoupling element, the combination of hubris and insecurity, the sense that time is closing to actually seize the moment, the domestic political pressures. There are some parallels that are kind of worrisome. And at the same time, though, there are some really important differences. It's a much more globalized world today. China cannot survive autarky. Japan had a credible case that autarky in Asia, seizing French, British, Dutch colonies for natural resources, would allow Japan's economy to continue growing and Japan to have a sphere of influence. China can't do that. The autarky is not going to work for China. And the demographics are different. There were a lot of young Japanese. One child policy means war for China. That's it. You're one kid gone. So And the other big difference, frankly, is if you look at the balance of power in Asia, Japan was rising as China was weak. European colonies were ripe for the picking, and the US was retreating. The US didn't build a new battleship from like 1923 to 1933. We were absent. The US has some wobbliness sometimes these days, but there's a much more healthy balance of power. India, Japan, Australia, Korea, the US, it's not NATO, but it is a collection of countries that don't want Chinese hegemony and that China needs for trade. So there are a lot more positive trends than in the 1930s, but I do think we can learn from some of the negative trends and think about what that means. There's some lessons in that. And I saw in the chat a number of questions about Xi Jinping, and one big difference is that Japan in the 30s had a collective leadership where nobody could make a decision, where Xi Jinping really has the strongest leadership model in China since, I was going to say Deng Xiaoping, but maybe since Mao Zedong. That's bad in one sense, but it's good in another sense. You can talk to somebody. So maybe there's some lessons there that point to a better diplomacy. Thank you. Good question. I feel like I just went through my MA oral exam. I don't know if I passed.
Yeah, no, you flying colors, Mike. Thank you very, very much. I think we all really enjoyed having a conversation with you. And I want to thank everybody. We ran about 30 minutes over time, but you know what? It was great. I didn't want it to end either, but we do need to wrap this up. Mike, again, on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you, and everybody have a good evening.